Welcome back to DistroWars here on Switched to Linux. Well, today we want to have a look at Fedora versus Ubuntu, and one of the things I want to do is I want to look at it in light of these being the two operating systems that PrivacyTools is using as their recommended introductory operating systems. Now, I did a video recently about why I thought Ubuntu was a very weird choice for this, and I kind of stand by that video. And I think a lot of you guys that watch that video do actually agree with me on that basis. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and have a look at these two distributions and ask, number one, are they going to be fundamentally private? Number two, are they good for your basic users? And number three, how are they for just basic Linux distributions compared to one another? You will find that these are probably some of the more different distros that we have looked at. Really, the only thing they have in common is they both use the GNOME desktop environment, although Ubuntu's is heavily modified. Now, again, if you are unfamiliar with PrivacyTools.io, it is an excellent website which will show you a variety of different recommended software that they have for various different types of services. So under providers, if you're looking for email, you can come on over here and you can look at the various recommended email services that they have. They do stay on these things. If there is some question about some service, then they will evaluate it and they will add things on, take things off. So you can look for, here's calendar, content sync tools, stuff like that. There's just a variety of different things you can find over on their site. So definitely a nice tool to go to. So they recommend, if you are looking for a simple to use operating system that is going to respect your privacy, they're going to recommend Ubuntu and Fedora. And let's go ahead and have a look at these. So having a look at Fedora first, this is at getfedora.org. And the current version as of this video is Fedora 32. You have a couple of options. You can grab the server, which is, it's a server. It's going to be a headless system. You're going to use command line tools. The workstation is going to have the GNOME desktop environment. You can actually go ahead and download it. Now, if you want a different desktop environment, down here under your alt downloads, there's things like I usually use the net installer, which used to be called the Fedora net installer. Now I think it's the Fedora everything installer, I believe. So there's a lot of varieties. So the net installer allows you to choose your desktop environment. Now Ubuntu doesn't have that particular option, but they do have community flavors. So you can go ahead and if you want of different desktop environment, they will probably have it. And even if they don't have it, you can go with one of the other many other distributions that are derived on Ubuntu with whatever desktop environment you are wanting to use. For the purposes of this video, we're going to look at the basic defaults, the standard Ubuntu, which is based on a modified GNOME, and Fedora, which is also based on GNOME in the workstation. So go ahead and download that. I think they're both about a 1.8 gig download, so you can go ahead and download those. With Ubuntu, we also have a variety of different options. They have the Ubuntu server. If you're wanting to run a web server somewhere, you have Mac and Windows, ARM, IBM Power. There's so many different options on these. And the Ubuntu server is pretty good. If I'm spinning something up in AWS, I usually use the Ubuntu server. If I'm doing something locally here, I'll usually use a Debian-based server. It doesn't really matter. What we're looking at is the 2004.1 desktop. That is the current version of Ubuntu at the time of recording this video. So with those in mind, let's talk briefly about the installation before we go ahead and show off the video or the distributions themselves. As far as the installation goes, Fedora has, I think, probably a little bit better. It has a more OEM installer. You go ahead and run through your settings. It installs pretty quick, and then on first boot, you create your user accounts, you choose your options and things like that. They don't have any minimal or non-minimal options, where Fedora is going to be a little bit different from Ubuntu, and we'll talk about this when we get into the videos, is it has a more free and open source software philosophy, whereas Ubuntu's philosophy is, hey, we want to work on as much hardware as conceivably possible. So there's going to be some more proprietary blobs inside of Ubuntu. And that's neither good nor bad. That's just what it is. If you want to, you're absolutely hardcore, I have to have nothing but the free and open source software, Fedora is probably where you're going to want to lean. And if you're like, hey, I actually want to have, the thing that works the easiest with the least headaches, you're probably going to want to lean towards Ubuntu. So with that, let's go ahead and have a look at each of these in tandem, and we'll talk about the means to install. We'll talk about basically what the desktop looks like. So first up, let's head on over to Fedora. So here we are booting up. It's going to tell us down here on the bottom we have Fedora. Everything is very nice on Fedora, and really this is one that if you asked me a couple years ago, I would probably tell you, yeah, probably not the best for user friendliness. In fact, probably one of the worst for user friendliness. But in the more recent years, I'd say starting around like 29 or so, Fedora has really made a lot of strides towards user friendliness. And in that spirit, I think that Fedora is definitely a good distribution for new users at this point in time, albeit it runs a slightly different philosophy. So here we are on the desktop here. And before we do anything else, let's go ahead and boot up a terminal. And then we are going to see if htop is installed. It is not. So to install software, there is the GNOME software store, but what they actually have is DNF. So we're going to do sudo DNF install htop and enter our password. And that hopefully will find, is it going to? There it goes. Okay, I was like, uh-oh, please tell me I didn't do something wrong. It's being very slow right now for some reason. I'm not sure why. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about that while we are installing htop. We'll probably have to do the same thing on Ubuntu. The installation process, Fedora uses DNF. I think it also has yum installed as well, but DNF is the one that I generally use versus Ubuntu uses apt. The difference on them, they're actually fairly similar. DNF will check for updates every single time that you go to install something, so you do not have to run the apt update and then apt upgrade. You just do the apt or the sudo DNF update, and it does everything all at once. That's actually a decent difference there. So we're running on about 844 megabytes of RAM. So that's actually not too bad there. All right. So let's go ahead and I guess we'll have to, it's not accepting my super keys to close that. All right, well, anyway, let's go ahead and close it the good old-fashioned hardcore way there. The other means you have of installing software is they use the GNOME Software Center here on Fedora. So this is what Ubuntu used to use. Now Ubuntu is using the Snap Store by default, and we'll get into that when we look at Ubuntu. But installing your software, you're going to find it's going to have anything that is free and open source software, but anything that does not have free tools in it, you're probably not going to find in the repository. So if we were to come in here and search, for example, VLC, a popular media player, it is not going to be able to find it. That's because that does have some proprietary blobs in it, and Fedora does not include that type of stuff out of the box. So in order to install things like that, you need to enable the RPM Fusion repositories. There used to be an option in here in the settings for the GNOME Software Center. There used to be some, I think it was under repositories, where you could turn it on or off. Now they don't give you the entirety of RPM Fusion, but you do have options for NVIDIA drivers and for Steam. Anything else, you need to actually add it. The RPM Fusion, it is well documented inside of the Fedora's documentation, but if you want to go ahead and install this, then you have the package, the RPM package base. So what we're going to do is rpmfusion.org, and then we're going to do configuration. Notice that this is a capital C. If you go to a lowercase c configuration, it lands on a page not found. So you're going to select your particular version here, and this is going to give you a .rpm file. This is the advantage of running Ubuntu will have .deb files, and Fedora has .rpm files. And these are extra means of packaging software. For example, my printers will have .deb or .rpm versions of their individual drivers. And so whether I'm using Fedora or Ubuntu, I can easily install my software. The next thing you need to do, you can enable the non-free. So then this is going to give us the ability to install things like VLC and multimedia codecs. So go ahead and enter our password there. Let's go ahead and, well, that's doing its thing. Let's go ahead and see if there's anything else. Here is if you want to do it all with the command line, just copy and paste these guys in. It looks all scary if you're brand new to Linux, but don't let it frighten you. It's not really a problem. All right, so now that those are set up, that should not require a reboot, but we will need to come into software repositories, and we will need to turn these on. So here, okay, they are actually enabled already by default. So now when we go ahead and search, we should be able to see VLC in there at this point. Here's non-free codecs. So if you wanted to install your non-free codecs, these are going to give you things like MP3, MPEG-2 AAC, MPEG-4, so a lot of your multimedia codecs for, DVDs and things like that. So here's license issue codecs. There's a lot of different options you have down here. So any codecs that are missing, you will now be able to use the H.264. You might need this for some things. You can go ahead and install these. So this is the type of stuff you're going to be able to get when you install your RPM Fusion non-free. What I have to double check on is we should be able, one of those should be able to activate VLC. So let's go into the terminal and see if VLC is available at this point. So we'll do sudo dnf install VLC. It should run an update of all of the repositories, and then it should hopefully install that. I think what happened is we might have to reboot the system to get that showing up. So there you can see now it's doing our non-free RPM Fusion as well as everything else. And now we have the ability to install VLC. So I just pick out VLC as a package to illustrate in this case because VLC is a common multimedia package that Fedora does not allow to install on your basic default. So this is installing some extra codecs that will help run everything you want to run. These are some of the things that used to be a lot more difficult to do with Fedora. You can see they've added the ability to do it through the graphical user interface. For those people that wanted to run it with a terminal, they gave you the options for those as well. So there we have it. We have that installed. And so now, let's just go. You can see VLC is now installed. That's going to be your downside here on Fedora, is that you are not going to have a lot of the media codecs out of the box. There's going to be some issues with running some software. All right, as far as our GNOME version, we are running GNOME 3.36.6, and we are on Wayland right here. All right, so let's double check if there's anything else I wanted to look at real quick. Oh, options for auto updates and update notifications. Fedora by default does not notify you of any updates, but if you boot up the GNOME software store, you will see an update notification up here. So you do basically have to manually check for updates. Ubuntu is going to automatically check for updates and give you a notification and the ability to click the button to install your updates. You do have an option to install updates automatically, and it is a full update. It basically will run a regular DNF update in the background of your system. You have to install a package and configure that. Whereas Ubuntu has an option for some updates, not all updates, but you do have to have an Ubuntu account for that. So there we have Fedora. Let's go ahead and have a look at Ubuntu next. All right, so here we are on Ubuntu. You'll notice that the login screens are very similar. Ubuntu is going to default out of the box to Xorg instead of Wayland, whereas Fedora defaults to Wayland. It might run a little bit snappier on my virtual machine here. That's just a function that Wayland works way better on real hardware than on virtualization. So that's nothing I ever really criticize. So when we install Ubuntu, there's a couple of things that I brought up in my PrivacyTools.io video. I'm going to mention them briefly here, but they're nothing we're going to dwell on in this video. The first is, on first install, they want a system profile of your computer, which I'm kind of against. Even though in principle it's nothing that's too major, it's still collecting a form of data that I would figure that PrivacyTools would not necessarily like. The other thing I mentioned is that the Snap Store, if you are installing Snaps by default, Snaps do collect a lot of information, system information as well, and send that to not only the Snap Store, but the developers. We're not going to dwell on those things, but the other thing that I would like to mention is on first boot on both of these, you have to choose whether location services is on or off. Ubuntu appropriately has that off with the ability to toggle on. Fedora's is on with the ability to toggle it off. So Ubuntu wins a couple points on that one. As far as out of the box, let's go ahead and boot up our terminal. And I'm pretty sure HTOP is not installed. It is not. So in order to install it over here with apt, you will generally have to run the update first. And this is where some people are not as big of fans of the apt application. You need to run your update first if you have not updated it for a while. In this case, it's going to go through, double check the package list, make sure everything is there. And so now we will be able to sudo apt install htop. There is a system monitor tool that is pre-installed on both of these, I believe, but we're going to use htop because it works. It takes less resources to actually run it. So here, htop, you can see this one's actually running a little bit less memory, about 200 megs less. I think the other one was 844. This is just shy of 700 megabytes. So as far as our RAM usage on both these guys, they're both pretty good. And hey, look at that. I was actually able to exit out of htop with my keyboard keys like I was anticipating being able to do. This is still GNOME, albeit it does look a little bit different. They have themed it with the sidebar. They have themed your applications over like this. And for the most part, though, it is GNOME. It's just a differently themed GNOME to kind of match the way Ubuntu has generally always looked. And frankly, I think it's just fine. It is what it is, and I have zero problems with it. I was looking for my version of GNOME. So we are running 3.36.3. So we are running a little bit older version of GNOME on Ubuntu. We're still in the 3.36 branch, and so it's not exactly super old. It's just, it's missing the last, 3-point upgrades. Nothing major out of there. I had mentioned that there is an update tool. The update tool here, it does run in the background, and it's going to give you a pop-up notification if there is an update to do, and then you'll have the ability to just click the button to run your updates. The other difference that we are going to find is Ubuntu runs the Snap Store. So out of the box default, Ubuntu runs not only the apt applications, and this version of Ubuntu is patched so that all of your icons will work. But we also run snaps by default. And so this opens up a few more software options that are not necessarily available on Fedora out of the box. Like you'll notice if we do a search for VLC, we should have not one, but probably a few options for VLC here. One of these is going to be from the repository. One of these is going to be from a snap package. And so you are going to have a little bit more options for installing software on Ubuntu. This one looks like it's probably from the repository. Ubuntu Focal Universe means it's from the repository. And this one over here is going to be from the snapcraft.io. For the snaps, you can choose whether you're on the latest stable, the latest candidate, the latest beta, or the latest edge. So there's a few different options in there if you would like to run different software packages. I've, of course, generally been critical about snaps, but for the purpose of what we're doing here, I want to point out that snaps are a decent way to get extra software that you may not otherwise have access to in a basic repository. So we do actually have the ability there to install software and extra software. I did mention that there is a tool for automatic updates. This is through the live patch system. And the live patch system, the downside is you have to have a Ubuntu account. So you'll see the sign in button over here. If you do want these, it does not install every update like Fedora's does, but it will install the updates that do not, that will require a system reboot. This is more of something that you're going to want to enable on a server, less of something that you want to enable on a desktop, because you can go in, you can see when the updates are, and Ubuntu is going to give you an update notification that there is definitely an update to run. So I don't see live patch as something as useful on the desktop. As far as the multimedia codecs, Ubuntu has the option on install to install all of the multimedia codecs. That's something Fedora does not do. And you need to run the RPM Fusion to get the codecs installed on Fedora. We talked about the RAM, the GNOME version, and auto updates. So those are pretty much all of your basics. I would say let's talk about which one of these guys is going to be better for your use case. If we're talking about user-friendly distributions, I'm going to give this one clearly to Ubuntu. It is going to, not only is it a wider name recognition, but it also does some things to make the system work better on more hardware. You're not going to have a problem whether you're doing NVIDIA or not. It's going to have a driver utility to install anything extra without fighting with it. You don't have to fight with multimedia codecs. All of the software that you want and more is going to be there, especially more of your more popular software like Spotify and Skype and things like that are coming on down the pipeline, are becoming available as snap packages, so you can install those out of the box. Now, me on a personal level, I'm not as big of a fan as Ubuntu, but if we are evaluating these for the usability of your new user switching to Linux, Ubuntu is going to get this one. Neither one of them is necessarily intuitive to use as far as somebody switching from a Mac or from a Windows PC, but Ubuntu at least gives us a nice sidebar where we can see the most commonly used applications. The Snap Store does have more applications than Fedora does out of the box, and you're not going to have to fight with anything to get multimedia codecs and things like that working. So on the basis of what we are comparing and evaluating here, I'm actually going to go with Ubuntu in this. Although, on a personal level, I do like Fedora a little bit better these days. That's my individual personal thought, but Ubuntu is the one to go to if you're switching to Linux and you want the best overall user experience. Go for Ubuntu, for sure. All right, so there is our distro wars for the day. You can help support the channel over on switchedtolinux.com/support. Follow along on the social media accounts there. That way, you'll get the notifications because YouTube may or may not be pushing out such notifications. You can find the videos on YouTube and over on BitChute as well eventually. Thanks for coming along, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux. Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.